Lynn Bradley was on a cruise with her family. By morning, she was gone. No noise. No struggle. No sign of what happened. And the strangest part? There is nothing that shows she ever left the ship. Which should not be possible. Because you do not just disappear from a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. But somehow, she did. Lynn Bradley boarded the cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas with her family in March of 1998, and if you just look at it from the outside, it really does seem like a completely normal trip. Family vacation, Caribbean route, nothing unusual in the plan, nothing that would make you think anything like this could happen. But when you slow it down and actually go through that night step by step, certain things start to feel off. Not in an obvious way, more like details that don't mean much on their own, but together they don't quite sit right. Amy was the kind of person who talked to people easily. She wasn't withdrawn, she wasn't isolated, if anything, she blended in quickly wherever she went, and that matters more than it seems here. Because that night, she spent hours around the same group of people. Not just random passengers, but also crew members, people who were working on the ship, people who would have known the layout, the routines, how things function. And at the time, none of that stands out. It just looks like someone enjoying a night out on a cruise. She and her brother stay out late, longer than their parents, moving between the club and the deck, music playing, people everywhere, that kind of atmosphere where you stop paying attention to time. At some point, her brother decides to head back to the cabin. Amy doesn't go with him. Not because anything is wrong, just because she isn't done yet, and on a cruise like that, staying a bit longer doesn't feel like a risk. Hours pass. Sometime in the early morning, she finally goes back to the room. Her father wakes up briefly when she comes in, just for a moment, and he sees her outside on the balcony. He doesn't think anything of it. And that part is important, because if there was anything obviously wrong in that moment, he would have noticed. He goes back to sleep. And when he wakes up again, she's not there anymore. Now this is where things start to break down a bit. There's no clear sign that she left the cabin in a hurry, no noise reported, nothing that suggests something happened right there in the room. At the same time, there's also no solid indication of how she would have left the ship on her own, especially without anyone noticing. And that's the part that keeps coming back in this case. Not just that she disappeared, but how clean that disappearance is. On a ship full of people, cameras, crew, movement at all hours. There's no moment you can point to and say, that's when she left. Once Amy was reported missing, at first it didn't immediately feel like something extreme. On a ship like that, with thousands of people, it's actually not that hard to lose track of someone for a while. You assume they went somewhere, another deck, another part of the ship, maybe just needed time alone. So in the beginning, it still feels manageable. A delay, not a disappearance. But then time keeps passing. An hour, then another. And nothing changes. No one can point to a moment where they saw her after that balcony. Not clearly, not in a way that helps. Just fragments, half memories, nothing you can actually build on. And that's usually the point where things either come together or start falling apart. Here, they fall apart. Because the more they try to rebuild her last few hours, the less stable it becomes. You'd expect the timeline to tighten, to get sharper with more people involved. Instead, it starts to blur. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. On a cruise ship, movement isn't random. There are routines, cameras, crew assigned to specific areas, especially during the night when anything out of the ordinary stands out more. So if Amy moved through that ship after her father last saw her, someone should have noticed. Not maybe. Someone should have. And yet, there isn't a single clean sighting you can rely on. That's the part that keeps coming back in this case. Not just that she disappeared, but how little resistance there is in the timeline. No clear interruption, no moment where everything points in one direction. It just stops. Now, if something happened inside the cabin, you'd expect signs. noise, movement, anything that suggests she didn't leave on her own. But nothing like that is reported. Which pushes everything back outside that room. And that creates a different problem. Because once you assume she left that cabin alive, you have to explain how she moved through a controlled environment without triggering attention, not from passengers, not from crew, not from anyone. And that's where small details start to matter more than they should. There are mentions of crew members she spoke to earlier that night. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately raises alarms, just interactions that, at the time, meant nothing. But later, they start to feel less random. Not enough to prove anything, but enough that you can't ignore them completely. Because at this point, the question isn't just where Amy went. It's how she managed to disappear in a place where disappearing shouldn't really be possible. And the more you sit with that, the harder it becomes to believe this was just chance. At some point, the focus quietly shifts away from the ship itself, because if everything ended there, this case probably wouldn't still be talked about the way it is. What keeps it alive are the reports that start coming in later, and the uncomfortable part is that they don't come all at once, and they don't sound identical, they appear over time, from different places, with just enough detail to make you stop and think about them a bit longer than you probably should. One of the earlier ones comes from a taxi driver, who says he picked up a woman that looked like Amy, traveling with two men, and nothing about the situation stood out as clearly wrong at first, but the way he described it later, it didn't feel like a normal interaction you'd expect between people on vacation. Then there's another account, and this one is harder to ignore, not because it's proven, but because of how specific it is. A man claims he met a woman in a brothel in Curaçao, and according to him, she approached him first, started talking, and at some point told him her name was Amy. He says she asked for help. And then she disappeared again before anything could be done. Now, stories like that are easy to dismiss, and in a lot of cases, they should be. When a disappearance gets this much attention, people come forward with all kinds of claims, some honest, some mistaken, some just trying to be part of something bigger. But what makes this different is that these reports don't completely collapse under pressure either. They're not strong enough to confirm anything, but they're also not vague enough to ignore completely, and that puts the whole case in a strange position where you're left with possibilities that don't fully connect, but don't disappear either. Because if even one of those sightings is real, even partially, then the story doesn't end on that ship. It continues somewhere else, in a way that's much harder to track, and a lot less visible than anything that happened that night. And that's where things start to feel less like a missing person case, and more like something that slipped through at the exact moment no one was really looking closely. Not because people didn't care, but because nothing at the time forced them to. At this point, the case doesn't really move forward in a straight line anymore, and that's where it starts to feel harder to hold onto anything solid. It kind of spreads out instead, depending on what you focus on: the timeline on the ship, the lack of physical evidence, the later reports, and the problem is that none of those directions fully explain what happened, but none of them disappear either. So no matter where you start, you keep ending up in the same place. That balcony. Early morning, quiet, nothing unusual on the surface, just a moment that looks completely normal if you don't already know what comes next. Her father sees her there, briefly, and there's nothing about it that makes him stay awake or question it. So he goes back to sleep. And somewhere between that moment and the next few hours, something changes. Because after that, there isn't a clear transition you can follow. No point where things obviously shift from normal to wrong. It just stops making sense. And usually, even in complicated cases, you still get some kind of direction. A mistake, a gap, something that at least points you somewhere. Here, that never really forms. So people try to explain that gap. Some go straight to the idea that she fell, that it was an accident, something sudden, something no one noticed in time. But when you actually look at it, that explanation doesn't sit right. There's nothing solid that supports it, and the conditions around it don't really line up in a way that makes it feel complete. Others believe she left the cabin on her own and somehow made it off the ship. But that creates a different problem. Because now you're not just explaining a disappearance, you're explaining movement through a controlled environment, past areas where people should have seen her, past systems that are supposed to notice when something is out of place. And still, nothing. And that's where it starts to feel off in a more serious way. Because the ship didn't just lose her. That idea sounds simple, but the more you think about it, the less it holds. For something like that to happen, there would usually be friction somewhere, someone noticing, something slightly out of place, a moment that stands out later. But here, that moment never appears. Which leaves one possibility that people don't settle on easily, but also don't fully dismiss. That something happened in that gap of time, after she was last seen, in a way that didn't draw attention. Not loud, not chaotic, just controlled enough to pass through everything around it without stopping. And that's difficult to accept, because it means the environment didn't fail in an obvious way. It means whatever happened fit inside it. And once you start looking at it like that, the question changes slightly. It's not just where Amy went. It's how something like that could happen in a place where movement is supposed to be visible. Because the more you go through it, the harder it becomes to see this as coincidence. It starts to feel more like something passed through that entire system, and nothing pushed back. When you step back from everything, what makes this case difficult isn't just that Amy disappeared, it's how little actually stays solid once you move past that last moment on the balcony. Up to that point, everything feels normal. After it, nothing really settles into something you can follow with confidence. You can look at it from different angles, try to build a clear explanation, but every time it almost works, something small pulls it apart again. An accident sounds possible at first, until you realize there's nothing that clearly supports it. Leaving on her own feels simple, until you try to trace how that would actually happen on a ship like that. There's also the idea that something happened inside that environment. It doesn't come with proof, but it doesn't disappear either. And that's what keeps this case where it is. Not solved, not completely open, just stuck somewhere in between. Because this isn't only about someone going missing. It's about the fact that it happened in a place where people are always around, where movement is supposed to be visible, where something out of place should stand out. But here, nothing ever clearly does. So instead of answers, you're left with a gap. A small window of time where everything still looks normal on the surface. And yet, whatever happened there was enough to remove her completely from that space. Once you look at it that way, the question shifts slightly. Not just where Amy went, but what actually happened in that moment. When nothing seemed wrong. And still, something clearly was.